It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, but a fleeting touch and a single glance shifted everything. What happens when buried feelings surface, threatening to unravel a family? Stay tuned to see how this tangled story unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales like this one. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. It was the kind of family vacation that should have been picture perfect. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the secluded beach resort James had so generously paid for, as the sound of waves lapping against the shore filled the air. My husband, Tom, was already unpacking our bags while chatting animatedly with my parents. Everything seemed normal, perfect, but the moment I stepped onto the resort's veranda, a familiar yet unsettling energy coursed through me. James, my uncle, stood by the railing with a drink in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His figure was striking as always, effortlessly put together in a white linen shirt and tailored shorts. At 46, he exuded the kind of charm that could make women blush and men shrink in comparison. He turned just as I approached, flashing that signature grin I had seen melt countless hearts at family gatherings. "There she is," he said warmly, pulling me into a hug. His cologne, a blend of cedarwood and something spicy, wrapped around me as his arms lingered just a second too long. "You look stunning, as always." I forced a smile, trying to brush off the subtle pang of discomfort. "Thanks, Uncle James. It's been a while." "Far too long," he said, his gaze holding mine for just a beat longer than necessary. "But I'm glad you made it. This place wouldn't be the same without you." It was a comment laden with ambiguity, one that left me flustered as I made my way inside to join the others. I told myself I was imagining things, projecting insecurities that had no place here. Still, the unease clung to me, like sand you couldn't quite shake off after a walk on the beach. That evening, as we gathered for dinner under a canopy of fairy lights, James was the life of the party. He regaled everyone with stories of his travels, his booming laughter cutting through the ocean breeze. Even Tom seemed taken by him, joining in with his own anecdotes while I sat quietly swirling my glass of wine. I tried to focus on my husband, his easy smile and boyish charm, the very qualities that had once made me fall for him. But for reasons I couldn't explain, my eyes kept drifting back to James. There was a magnetism about him, a pull I had felt since I was old enough to recognize such things. He wasn't just attractive. He was intoxicating. The kind of man who could make you feel like you were the only person in the room, even when surrounded by a crowd. When the conversation shifted to memories of family vacations past, James leaned closer to me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Do you remember that summer at the lake? You were what, 17? You had that sundress with the sunflowers. Couldn't believe how grown up you looked." I froze, my stomach tightening at the memory. Of course I remembered. It had been one of those fleeting moments that meant nothing and everything all at once. I had worn that dress to impress a boy from the next cabin over, but it was James's quiet compliment that had stayed with me. "I think I've outgrown sundresses," I replied, forcing a laugh. "Pity," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes unreadable. "They suited you." Tom interrupted then, oblivious to the charged exchange. He draped an arm around my shoulder and kissed my temple, his affection a grounding force. "You okay?" he asked softly, his concern genuine. "Yeah," I lied, "just tired from the trip." As the days went on, the tension between James and me became harder to ignore. It was in the way his gaze lingered when I walked into a room, the way his hand would brush against mine during casual interactions, and the way his compliments felt just a shade too intimate. My husband didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he trusted me too much to think anything of it. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I found myself on the balcony, unable to sleep. The air was warm, the ocean stretching out before me like an endless abyss. I was lost in thought when I heard the sliding door open behind me. "Couldn't sleep either?" James asked, stepping out to join me. He had a glass of whiskey in hand, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. Too much on my mind, I guess. He leaned against the railing, his proximity making my skin tingle. "You've always been like that, always overthinking. It's what makes you so... you." I turned to face him, my defenses weakening under the weight of his gaze. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're special," he said simply, his voice soft but unwavering. "More than you realize." For a moment I didn't know how to respond. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, a tension that had been building for years without either of us acknowledging it. My heart was racing, and I hated myself for how his words made me feel. Seen, desired, alive. "I should go," I said abruptly, stepping back toward the door. James reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "Don't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." I stared at him, torn between the pull of his presence and the weight of my own conscience. In that moment, I saw something in his eyes: vulnerability, regret, and something darker, a secret waiting to be unveiled. "I can't," I whispered, pulling my hand away. "Good night, James." As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was more terrifying: the way he made me feel, or the realization that part of me didn't want to resist. The next morning, I awoke with a knot in my stomach, the events of the previous night playing on a loop in my mind. James had always been charming, even disarming, but now it felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to something I couldn't control. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining meaning where there was none, but the memory of his touch, his words, was too vivid to dismiss. Tom greeted me with his usual bright smile, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said, kissing my forehead. "I was thinking we could hit the trails today. The guide said there's a waterfall about an hour's hike from here." "That sounds nice," I replied, forcing myself to match his enthusiasm. "Let me grab some coffee first." In the dining area, the family was already gathered, their chatter filling the room like a warm buzz. James sat at the head of the table, his easy laughter blending seamlessly into the conversation. He caught my eye as I entered, and for a fleeting moment the world around us seemed to fade. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on pouring my coffee. "You're joining us for the hike, right?" James asked casually, though his gaze lingered. I hesitated. "Come on," James said, flashing a grin that could melt glaciers. "The more the merrier." Before I could respond, my mother chimed in. "It's a family vacation after all. You two can have your romantic moments later." Tom, ever the peacemaker, shrugged. "Sure, why not?" The hike was picturesque, the trail winding through lush greenery and the occasional clearing that offered breathtaking views of the ocean below. I tried to lose myself in the beauty of the surroundings, but James's presence was like a shadow, constant and unyielding. He walked beside me, close enough that our arms occasionally brushed, sending an unbidden thrill through me each time. "You've been quiet," he said after a while, his tone low enough that only I could hear. "Everything okay?" I nodded, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Just enjoying the scenery." "Funny," he said, a playful edge to his voice. "I thought I was the one distracting you." I stopped in my tracks, glaring at him. "What are you doing, James?" He smirked, unrepentant. "What am I doing? I'm just talking." "No, you're not," I snapped, keeping my voice low to avoid drawing attention. You're pushing boundaries." "And what if I am?" he asked, his gaze challenging. "You can't tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to retort, but the words caught in my throat. I hated him for saying it, for putting into words the thing I had been trying so hard to bury. Before I could respond, Tom called out from up ahead. "You two coming?" "Right behind you," I called back, my voice strained. Without another word, I pushed past James and quickened my pace. The waterfall was stunning, a cascading veil of water that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. While the others splashed in the shallows, I sat on a rock at the edge of the pool, trying to collect my thoughts. James was giving me space, but I could feel his eyes on me, a silent reminder that nothing had been resolved. Tom waded over, his boyish grin as endearing as ever. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." He tilted his head, studying me. "You've seemed a little off this trip. Is something bothering you?" I hesitated, torn between my loyalty to him and the chaos James had stirred within me. "No," I lied. "I think I just need a nap." "Belle," he said, leaning in to kiss my temple, "make sure you save some energy for tonight. They're setting up a bonfire on the beach." I nodded, guilt twisting like a knife in my gut. He deserved better than half-truths and evasions, but what could I say? That his wife was battling feelings she had no business entertaining? Later that evening, the bonfire blazed against the darkening sky, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill I felt inside. The family gathered around, laughing and toasting marshmallows as the ocean roared in the distance. I sat beside Tom, leaning into his familiar warmth, but my mind was elsewhere. On the man sitting across the fire. James seemed unusually quiet, his usual charisma muted. I caught him watching me several times, his expression unreadable, as if he were weighing a decision. As the night wore on, people began to drift away, retreating to their rooms or taking walks along the beach. Soon it was just me, James, and the dying embers of the fire. Tom had gone to bed, exhausted from the hike. "Granmy, you're playing a dangerous game," I said quietly, not looking at him. "So are you," he replied, his voice low and steady. I turned to face him, anger flaring. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he said, leaning forward, his eyes boring into mine. "You think I haven't noticed? The way you look at me, the way you respond when I touch you." I stood abruptly, the heat of his words igniting something primal in me. "You're out of line. And yet, you're still here," he said, rising to his feet. "You could have walked away a long time ago, but you didn't. So, what do you want?" Tears stung my eyes, a mix of anger, guilt, and something I couldn't name. "You don't understand. This, whatever this is, it can't happen." "Why not?" he asked, his voice softening. "Because of Tom? Because of the family? Or because you're afraid of what it says about you?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that standing there, inches apart, I felt more alive than I had in years. And that terrified me. "I'm going to bed," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Good night, James." As I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, heavy with unspoken words. I didn't look back. The tension between James and me had become a tangible thing, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. Every glance, every fleeting touch carried the weight of unspoken truths, and I felt like a fragile thread being pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. 2 days after the bonfire, the family planned a boat trip to explore nearby coves and hidden beaches. James volunteered to stay behind, claiming he wanted to relax and catch up on some work. I thought it would be a relief to be away from him, to have some time to clear my head, but as we sailed farther from the resort, a strange restlessness settled over me. Tom noticed. You've been a little quiet lately," he said as we lounged on the deck, the sun warm against our skin. "Are you sure everything's okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He kissed my hand, his eyes soft with concern. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" "I know," I said, guilt gnawing at me. "Thank you." The boat anchored at a secluded cove for swimming and snorkeling, and while the others plunged into the crystal-clear water, I stayed behind, claiming I wanted to read. The truth was, my thoughts were too loud, too chaotic to share space with anyone else. I couldn't stop thinking about James, his words, his touch, the way he seemed to see through every facade I had built around myself. By the time we returned to the resort, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the beach in hues of orange and pink. Tom went to join my parents for drinks on the patio, but I headed straight to our room, desperate for solitude. As I approached the door, I saw James sitting on the steps to his villa, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I knew I was lost. I don't know what possessed me to knock on his door that evening. Perhaps it was the weight of everything I hadn't said, or maybe it was the magnetic pull of the unresolved tension between us. He opened the door almost immediately, his expression a mix of surprise and something darker. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. His villa was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. I stood awkwardly in the center, unsure of how to begin. "You're making this impossible," I said finally, turning to face him. "Am I?" he asked, his tone calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "Or are you just fighting something you don't want to admit?" "Don't do that," I snapped. "Don't make this about me. You've been pushing boundaries since we got here, and it's not fair." "What's not fair?" he countered, stepping closer. "That I see you? That I make you feel something you've been pretending doesn't exist?" I felt tears prick my eyes, a mix of anger and despair. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice softening. "You're unhappy, even if you don't want to admit it. You're stuck in a life that feels safe but doesn't make you come alive." "Tom," I said, my voice trembling, "you have no right." "I have every right," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Because I see you, and I know what it's like to feel trapped," Eric clarified. "And you?" His words hit me like a blow, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The room seemed to close in around us, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's not real, isn't it? He asked, stepping closer until we were inches apart. Then why are you here? I couldn't answer. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was look at him, his face so close to mine, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and defiance. And then it happened, a moment of weakness, of surrender. He kissed me. The kiss was a lightning strike, a jolt that left me breathless and trembling. For a split second, I kissed him back, lost in the heat and intensity of it. But then reality came crashing down, and I pulled away, my heart racing. No, I said, my voice shaking. This is wrong. You know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But that doesn't mean it doesn't feel right. I backed away, my hands trembling. I can't do this. I love my husband. And I love you, he said simply, his words cutting through the air like a blade. I froze as confession rendering me speechless. He took a step toward me, his eyes filled with raw emotion. I've loved you for years, he said, even before I knew what it meant. And I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend it doesn't exist. Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head, unable to process the weight of his words. You don't mean that. Yes, I do, he said, his voice steady. And I think you feel the same way, even if you're too afraid to admit it. Please, I whispered, my voice breaking. Don't do this. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. I just need you to be honest with yourself. That's all I'm asking. I pulled my hand away, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. I need to go. He didn't stop me as I walked out the door, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy with unspoken words. By the time I reached my room, I was shaking, the enormity of what had just happened crashing down around me. The next day, I avoided him. I threw myself into family activities, clinging to Tom like a lifeline. But the weight of James' confession lingered, a shadow I couldn't escape. I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that I could forget everything and go back to the way things were. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That evening, as we gathered for dinner, James was conspicuously absent. My mother mentioned that he had gone into town for some errands, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding me as much as I was avoiding him. Tom leaned over, his brow furrowed with concern. Are you okay? You seem distracted. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. He kissed my cheek, his love and trust like a dagger to my heart. I didn't deserve him, not after what had happened. The final blow came later that night. I was walking along the beach, trying to clear my head, when I saw James sitting by the water, his shoulders hunched and his face buried in his hands. Against my better judgment, I approached him. James, I said softly. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with anguish. I'm sorry, he said, his voice raw. I never meant to hurt you. You didn't, I said, sitting down beside him. I hurt myself. We sat in silence for a long time, the waves crashing against the shore. Finally, he spoke. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something I should have told you a long time ago. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You're not just my niece, he said. There's more to our connection than you know. You're not just my niece. James's words hung in the air between us, a revelation that seemed to stop time. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. I stared at him, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his gaze locked on the horizon as if the weight of his confession was too heavy to look me in the eye. "It's complicated," he said, "but you deserve to know the truth." "Then tell me," I demanded, my voice trembling. "No more riddles, no more games." James turned to face me, his expression filled with a mixture of regret and something deeper. Something that looked a lot like fear. "Your father and I, we're not full brothers. We share the same mother, but my father was someone she had an affair with. A man she loved but couldn't be with. It's a secret she took to her grave, one that only I was ever told." I blinked, the weight of his words crashing over me like a tidal wave. "What does that have to do with me?" He hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of his next words. "The man she had the affair with." The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath me shifting in a way that left me breathless. What are you saying?" "Ah." "I'm saying," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes, "that we're more closely connected than you think. You're not just my niece by marriage, you're my niece by blood." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, suddenly felt like a lie. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why couldn't you just keep it to yourself?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," he said, his voice soft but unyielding, "and because it explains why I've always felt this way about you, why I can't seem to let you go." "This is insane," I said, shaking my head as tears streamed down my face. "You can't say these things to me. You can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "I know how wrong it is, but I can't change how I feel." I stood abruptly, the sand shifting beneath my feet as I struggled to find my balance. "This doesn't change anything," I said, my voice trembling. "It just makes everything worse." "Maybe," he said, rising to his feet, "but it's the truth." I left him there on the beach, his confession ringing in my ears as I made my way back to the villa. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to hate him for what he had said, for how he had turned my world upside down, but I couldn't. A part of me still felt drawn to him, despite everything. When I returned to the room, Tom was already asleep. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a long time. His face was peaceful, free from the turmoil that consumed me. He deserved better than this. Better than me. I crawled into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds. Something had to give. The next morning, I decided to confront the situation head-on. After breakfast, I asked James to meet me on the balcony, away from the prying eyes of the family. He agreed without hesitation, his expression unreadable as we stepped outside. "I need to make something clear," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever this is between us, it ends here. It has to." "I understand," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on me. "But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy," he murmured. "I don't care if it's easy," I said, my voice breaking. "I care about doing what's right." "And what about what you want?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet defiance. "What about what makes you happy?" Anon answered. "That doesn't matter," I said, tears streaming down my face. Not if it means hurting the people I love. James reached for my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. You deserve to be happy too, he said. Don't forget that. I pulled my hand away, my heart breaking all over again. I can't do this, I whispered. Not with you. He nodded, his expression filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. I'll respect your decision, he said. But I need you to know that I'll never stop caring about you. I turned away, unable to look at him any longer. Goodbye, James. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. I threw myself into family activities, avoiding James as much as possible. Tom seemed oblivious to the turmoil beneath the surface, his easygoing nature a stark contrast to my inner chaos. When the vacation finally came to an end, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. As we said our goodbyes, James pulled me into a hug, his touch lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Take care of yourself, he said quietly, his voice filled with meaning. You too, I replied, my voice trembling. As we drove away from the resort, I stared out the window, my thoughts a tangled mess. I knew that this chapter of my life was over, but the scars it had left behind would take much longer to heal. The drive back home from the resort felt endless, each mile stretching the silence between Tom and me. He was in high spirits, recounting the highlights of the vacation, but I could barely focus. My mind was too crowded with James's words, his confession still echoing in my thoughts. Once we reached home, the routine of daily life should have offered some relief, but instead, it magnified the cracks in my marriage. Tom was kind, attentive, and loving as always, but everything he did seemed to remind me of what I had nearly thrown away. The guilt was suffocating. I knew I couldn't go on like this. A week after returning home, I finally worked up the courage to have an honest conversation with Tom. We were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the evening sunlight casting long shadows on the walls. Kelly was wearing her day's outfit and wearing sunglasses that were fitting for her color. There's something I need to talk to you about, I began, my voice trembling. Tom turned to me, concern etched on his face. What is it? Are you okay? I hesitated, the weight of my words pressing down on me. I haven't been okay for a while, I admitted, and I think it's time we address that. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. What's going on? Is it about the trip? Partly, I said, my heart pounding. But it's more than that. I've been feeling disconnected from you, from myself, and I think it's been building for a long time. Tom's expression shifted, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I thought everything was fine, he said softly. You never said anything. I know, I said, tears welling in my eyes. And that's my fault. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I can't keep pretending everything is perfect when it's not. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. Do you still love me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. Yes, I said without hesitation. But love isn't enough if we're not really connecting. I need us to be honest with each other, even when it's hard. Tom nodded, his grip tightening on my hand. Then let's start now. Whatever it takes, I want to fix this. I want to fix us. Over the next few weeks, Tom and I began to rebuild our marriage, brick by brick. We started going to therapy, a safe space where we could air our grievances and work through the issues we had buried for years. I admitted my struggles with feeling unseen and unfulfilled. and Tom acknowledged the ways he had taken our relationship for granted. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to retreat back into the safety of denial. But with each step forward, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was starting to feel like myself again. But no matter how much progress we made, there was still a part of me that couldn't forget James. His confession had opened a wound that wouldn't heal, a question that lingered in the back of my mind. What if? A month after the vacation, I received an email from James. Seeing his name in my inbox sent a jolt through me, my heart pounding as I hesitated to open it. I knew I shouldn't, knew that any contact with him would only complicate things further, but curiosity won out. The email was short, his words careful but laden with meaning. I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I just want you to know that I don't regret telling you the truth. I'm sorry if it caused you pain, but I felt you deserved to know. Take care of yourself, and know that I'm here if you ever need to talk. Reading his words, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, longing. I didn't respond. I couldn't. But I also couldn't bring myself to delete the email. It sat in my inbox like a ghost, a reminder of the path I had chosen not to take. As time went on, the intensity of my feelings for James began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He would always be a part of my story, a chapter that had changed me in ways I was still coming to understand. But he wasn't my future. Tom was. One evening, as Tom and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reached for my hand, a small but significant gesture. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said, "working on us. I feel like I'm getting to know you all over again." "Me too," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. "I feel like I'm finally being honest. With you and with myself." He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that reminded me of why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. But life is never entirely neat, and some questions remain unanswered. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I sometimes find myself thinking about James, about what might have been, if things were different, if we were different. Those thoughts no longer fill me with guilt or regret, but they linger nonetheless, a reminder of the complexity of love and the choices we make. In the end, I chose to stay true to the life I had built with Tom, to the love we had fought to preserve. But James' secret and the feelings it had unearthed would always be a part of me, a reminder of how fragile and beautiful and terrifying it is to be human. And perhaps that was the greatest truth of all. I walked along the water's edge, the cold sand shifting beneath my feet, and let the memories wash over me. The laughter, the stolen glances, the moments of tension that had felt like fire and ice colliding. And then his confession, the words that had shattered everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. "Why did you have to tell me?" I whispered into the wind. "Why couldn't you just let me go?" But the wind offered no answers, only the sound of the waves, relentless and eternal. The weeks that followed were a blur of routine and quiet introspection. I threw myself into my marriage, into therapy, into creating a life with Tom that felt authentic and whole, We planned a weekend getaway, started discussing the possibility of children, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly partners. But James's absence was a ghost that lingered, haunting the edges of my mind. I wondered where he had gone, what his new life looked like, whether he thought of me as often as I thought of him. I wondered if he had found peace. The answer came unexpectedly, 6 months later, in the form of a photograph. It arrived in a plain envelope with no note or explanation. The image was of a small, sun-drenched cafe on the edge of a cobblestone street. James sat at a table, his face turned slightly away from the camera, a soft smile on his lips as he sipped a cup of coffee. He looked lighter somehow, freer, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. I stared at the photograph for a long time, my fingers tracing the edges. It felt like a message, a silent reassurance that he was okay, that he had found a way to move forward. And in that moment, I realized that I could, too. The years passed, as they always do, in a blur of milestones and quiet moments. Tom and I built a life together that was imperfect but real. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who filled our home with laughter and chaos. We celebrated anniversaries, navigated arguments, and weathered the storms that come with any long marriage. And through it all, we held on to each other, choosing love, even when it was hard. But James was never far from my thoughts. He was a chapter in my story that couldn't be erased, a reminder of the complexity of love and the choices that defined us. I kept his photograph in a small box, along with the letter he had written, tucked away in the back of my closet. I didn't look at them often, but knowing they were there brought me a strange sense of comfort. One day, many years later, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I came across the photograph again. My children were grown, my marriage solid and enduring, and the life I had built felt both ordinary and extraordinary in its own way. I held the photograph in my hands, tracing the image of James's face, and felt a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. For a moment, I wondered what my life might have been like if I had chosen differently, if I had let myself fall, if I had followed him into the unknown. But then I thought of Tom, of our children, of the life we had created together, and I knew I had made the right choice. James had been a spark, a flash of light that illuminated parts of me I hadn't known existed. But he wasn't my flame. That was Tom, and it always would be. As I placed the photograph back in the box, I whispered a quiet goodbye. To James, to the girl I had been, to the what-ifs that had haunted me for so long. And as I closed the box and returned it to the attic, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The door was finally closed for good this time, and I was ready to move forward, carrying the lessons and the love with me, but leaving the rest behind. It started innocently enough, a family vacation meant to bring us all closer. But what happens when one moment of connection becomes something you can't ignore? What if the person you trust most reveals a truth so shocking it threatens to unravel everything? This wasn't just a secret. It was a revelation that changed the course of my life forever. Will this forbidden bond remain hidden, or will the truth destroy the family I've fought so hard to protect? Stick around, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the dangerous pull of unspoken desires. Don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales like this, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from?